Our scripture text for this morning is from Matthew 13:24 to 30. Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' The slaves said to him, 'Do you want us then to go and gather them up?' But he said, 'No, for while you are gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn.'"
As I was thinking through the tastes of my childhood summer, I would say that the taste of my childhood summer were the fresh, vine-ripe tomatoes of my dad's garden. I'd stroll into the garden quite often, and I would sink my teeth into a bright red, summer sun-warmed tomato. Some of you may say, warmed. Those who know. I can see why many kids today don't like tomatoes that you get from the store, from restaurants, because they often taste like cardboard in comparison. They're just not the same. So I thought I would ruin your lunch a little bit this morning and tell you why. So it isn't just that they go and that they pick the fruit a little bit immature just as it turns and then let it turn red in transit. That's not how it works, because scientists they discovered that you could pick tomatoes completely immature and small before they even started to turn and make them turn uniformly red by fogging them with a natural enzyme called ethylene. So that's pretty much what they do. I looked it up again this week, looking at how that they get tomatoes how they do it from garden to market now, and they just pick them like this way. And it says this, in the University of Florida says, immature tomatoes can be ripened by exposure to externally applied ethylene, which is what they naturally produce when they're supposed to ripen, but they do it early. They fog them with it. But they never will develop comparable eating quality. No kidding, right? You go to the restaurant and you get a nice big giant hamburger, and if you like tomatoes, you get a tomato on it, and you open it up and it's got a tomato that's red around the outside and green and hard and disgusting in the middle. And I love tomatoes. And it's like, why can't you get your tomatoes? Like, my dad didn't have these problems. Why can't you get your tomatoes in order here? Ruining this hamburger. It's a total waste. It looks like the real thing on the outside, but in fact, it looks often like a very flawless, perfectly ripened tomato. But it poisons your taste buds on impact. Like, you just know something's not right. If we only had a little more patience, right? So I figured out that even the vine-ripened tomatoes that you see at the grocery store, most of them, don't mean that it was actually ripened on the vine. It means that it started to ripen on the vine. It had that little tint of yellow on it when they picked it, and then they picked the right exact time to spray the ethylene on it, and then they get it to the perfect look when you get to the grocery store. It doesn't mean that it actually ripened all the way on the vine. They picked it and then put it out there. That's farmer's market stuff. That's your really expensive tomatoes, right, at the store. These are not the fruit of my dad's garden. Now, before your mind goes too far down the rabbit hole conspiracy theories about food-borne health problems in our society, let that inclination of conspiracy help you interpret the very cosmic conspiracy which Jesus reveals with his own garden parable. First, a deceitful imitation systemically poisons us. Second, impatience causes more problems than it fixes. And third, trust the patience of the good gardener. A deceitful imitator sows chaos. That's how the parable basically starts, right? It's a parable, I always say this is a parable like guys. It's this one that's easy to understand but quite difficult to live with. So it's a joke about guys being easy to understand but hard to live with. Essentially, he sows good seed in his garden, and then the devil comes along, his enemy, comes behind him and sows bad seed. We might call it a weed. Tonight I might call it a weed. We call it tares. The more technical, precise name that around the world is called darnel. Darnel is the exact kind of weed that was likely spoken of here, and a weird Greek word is darnel. Comes to that. Darnel is a weed that imitates the look of wheat almost completely when it's immature. You really can't tell the difference at all between wheat and darnel when it's small. It was an evil practice that was actually practiced all the way from the Roman Empire to India in these ancient times. And it was such a horrible thing to do to somebody. The Romans had outlawed it, and with some pretty severe penalties if you decided to sow darnel into your neighbor's wheat field. So this is a familiar thing they would know about. So you couldn't tell the difference between the plants until they had fully matured. But you had to be careful at harvest even because darnel is somewhat poisonous. It would be poisonous to eat it. So the point of the enemy's tactics was to create confusion, to confuse and say, I don't know which one's which. I know there's bad. I know there's good. So he wants to create this very state of confusion. And I'm not talking about California. It isn't just people, cultures, or nations which are broken. That's what he's saying. He goes all the way down to the roots of reality. Evil is like a cancer which corrodes and destroys the very fabric of reality. So the very first point of the parable is that evil doesn't come from God. It comes from an enemy trying to pretend to imitate and sow confusion. One of the big arguments against God that people use all around the world and have for a very long time is that he allows evil to happen and doesn't do nearly enough to fix it in the now and the present. The Jews likely expected God's Messiah, we know they did, to come in and separate the weeds and the wheat, right then, right there. Meaning destroy the Romans, save the Jews, prop them up as the world leaders, and set the world right. And Jesus is saying, the kingdom won't work that way. Throughout the world, the kingdom is present and spreading, sowing the good seeds. That's what we're doing. When we share the gospel, we're sowing the good seeds. But now we have to live in a world mixed with God's followers and those who are against or careless about God. We're going to live in a world where this good kingdom and the evil kingdom are overlapping. And we have this reality that we're going to have to deal with evil. And that's just how it is, because that's the situation. Now, it also reminds us, when you read this and you start to think about this, before we go further into the meaning of it, it reminds us that we are not judges of good and evil. We're not the final arbiters. We can discern good and evil the best we can, but we are not the ones, we aren't the judge, jury, and executioners in this particular parable. He makes that fairly clear. See, evil is pernicious, in that the knowledge of good and evil tempts us to act like a god. That's what happened. That's why the eating from the garden, the tree of good and evil, it tempts us to think that we're the God who knows. We're the judge. We're it. We get to destroy. We get to bless. We get to honor. We get to this idea of the knowledge of good and evil. We think, well, that's a great thing. The problem with it is not just knowing good and evil, it's that we think that we can be the gods who decide and judge good and evil. That we can rectify evil. But how do we go about rectifying evil? This is what the devil always wanted to set up. We think that rectifying evil means committing an equivalent action and calling it justice. Eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And even the Old Testament says that, but Jesus goes, actually the kingdom is quite a bit different than that. You say an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say. And then you go, well, the one If your neighbor slaps you, what are you supposed to do? Turn the other cheek. It's not. Justice is delayed. It's handed to God. It's not that there won't be justice. It's that you're not the arbiter. You're not the judge of good and evil in the way that you think you are. You're not the one who can condemn it. You discern it. You recognize it. You run from it. And you even have to deal with it in the real world. But we're not the people who decide who go to heaven and who doesn't. In the sermon, again, on the Sermon on the Mount, it points it out again and again. Anything short of trusting God with justice, final justice, is poisonous imitation of God's character. What this means that a lot of people are duped. The lines between those in and out are not as clear as we think they are. A lot of people think they are Christians when they are not. It's kind of frightening, to be honest with you, when you read this text. This is a kind of a scary parable when you really dive into it. Almost everybody in this country still thinks they're Christians. Why? Well, they say they have a Christian tradition in their family. Maybe they're from a traditional Christian family. Maybe they uphold some Christian principles. They're a decent person. They go to church. But Jesus says there's a distinct difference that will be known by him at the end. Faith is the way, the identity marker. But faith without faithfulness to Jesus is a poisonous imitation gripping our country. In other words, faith has fruit. Faith has faithfulness which follows. Faithfulness doesn't save you, but faith has faithfulness which demonstrates who you are as well. I'll be really honest, it grieves me because I do have to do funerals. And I do funerals, sometimes I don't do tons of them. But I don't know who's really a Christian and who's not. And I try not to assume yes or no as I do them. But I know there is not a single funeral that I have ever been to in my life, not just done, but been to in my whole life that hasn't said, this person's now in heaven. No matter how they lived, no matter what they did, some were even hostile to Christianity. And more than that, it makes me pause. And I have to, when I look at this, it's not about, those people out there. It makes me pause and look at myself and say, am I the real thing? Am I the real thing? Are we the real thing? Or are we imitations? We're supposed to be imitating Christ. False imitations of a real Christian. A big clue seems to be, how do you think things are made right? How do you go about thinking things are made right? What's your process? Do you trust God will make things right? Now, we have to be involved in good and evil. We have police. We have different things. If you have to be involved, how do you go about it? Maybe you have something in your own personal life that's wrong. How do you go about saying, this needs to be rectified? This needs to be fixed. We need some kind of justice. Do you think of you being the person who's going to fix it by being on a cross or putting someone else up on a cross? Do you think I'm going to make a sacrifice or I'm going to eliminate someone? These are big differences. Are you patient enough to let God handle sorting out good and evil in His time? It's a big question for us about whether or not we're truly part of His kingdom. See, impatience causes more problems than it fixes. We don't want to wait on God. I don't like to wait on God either. I kind of would rather He just fix me right now, I say. I want Him to fix the little things I want Him to fix about me in the world. That's the real truth of the matter. See, the angels are servants. If you keep reading down in Matthew, you'll see that He gives you an equivalence of this thing means this, and that's why I say angels. The angels or servants in this parable are ready to rip out all the weeds and burn it, right? They're ready to just go through and be like, we're going to try to pull up every single weed and get rid of it and keep the good stuff. But the wise gardener here knows that the roots are entangled and it will damage the good wheat. And we say, where's the justice in that? You'll rip out wheat not yet matured is what God's saying. not yet turned to God. In other words, you'll be tearing up things that have not yet turned to me. If I go and I tear out all the evil in the world, there are still people out there who are going to find and be a part of my kingdom. As mentioned, we all want evil to be dealt with. I hate the evil I see going on around us. I hate the evil I see going on in me at times. It sickens us. We want God's judgment to come. We want it to get rid of it. We want to get rid of evil, or we think we do. Now, maybe you've noticed this inconsistency. I don't know if everybody, maybe it's because I'm a preacher, I noticed this particular inconsistency. But people hate for pastors and preachers to talk about judgment from the pulpit, judgment and sin. People hate when you talk about it, but they hold it against God that He's not doing it nearly enough. I want you to come and fix the world. I need justice, but I can't. But Pastor, don't talk about it. But God's not doing it enough. Just think about that. That is really where we are. And, the real reason is because we don't want judgment on us or our people like us, or all of those things. And God is saying, well, you may have to, I will wait and give grace for your friends and your family to bring my full justice on the whole earth and fix everything, but it's also going to be a time of grace for all your enemies too. And all those evil things you wish I'd fix right now, when I come and I fix everything, it will be everything. When you say, God, I wish He would fix everything. If He were really God, He'd fix everything. And God says, I plan to do that when I want to do that, and I will do it. And in the meantime, do you know what you're asking for? We're so impatient. There's a story about a lady who called American Airlines and asked the clerk, how long does it take to fly from DFW to Frankfurt, Germany? The clerk gets on her computer and she starts typing and looking up, and she can't really find it, and so she tells the lady, just a minute. The lady responds, thanks very much. Hangs up. Just a minute, it'll only take a minute to fly from, right? Why is that joke funny, right? That's obviously a joke. Why do you know that's obviously a joke? Because if you have any idea about how far it is to fly from Dallas to Germany, you know that it can't happen in just a minute. That's what makes the joke funny. The lady should have known that, right? We say, what a fool, right? What a dummy. Do you know the distance from our evil world to a perfect one? Do you know how great God's love is? Have you considered those things when you say, why aren't we there yet? How long does it take to get from this evil, corrupt world to a perfected one? We say, oh, but God is all powerful. He can do anything whenever He wants it. He could do it, we say. Of course He could. But isn't it the same group that only wants to talk about His love and second chances and grace? We have to trust God's timing to His love and His grace, whether it be for another minute or a millennia. Why trust Him? Why do we trust Him? Because He proved His love on a cross. He's worthy of your trust. He was willing to take on the very fabric, the very core of evil itself for you. And He was going to finish the job. He says, I'll come back, I'll finish the job. But He endured that evil. He didn't just sit up in heaven and say, oh, that's pretty rough on y'all. He came down and He endured the cross with us and for us. He knows what it is. He knows pain. He knows your hurt. He knows your struggle. He knows your trials. But His grace and love want to pull everyone who will accept Him out of that. And for now, He's waiting. And He's saying, go spread the word. Go tell the people. But we live in a culture of impatience. There's an old summary of the church I really like I'm not good at memorizing things, but once in a while, when I read something, it sticks in my mind so hard that I never forget it. And it goes like this. It's a very quick summary of the history of the church, or of the gospel. The gospel began as a message in Jerusalem, became a philosophy in Greece, an institution in Rome, a culture in Europe, and an enterprise in America. Now, enterprise is not a word that most of us think, except for maybe outside Star Trek. But an enterprise means to take something and say, I'm going to make it huge and big and make it like a market, right? I'm going to take it and go to the next level with everything. That's kind of my job, you know? The point is that every culture tries to take Christianity, make it in its image, and if you know church history, this is often fairly destructive. It corrodes, messes up, and people try to use it, you know? But the enterprising of America, that is something, again, for which we want to take, we want to grow, we want to reap, we want to harvest, we want to have it all, we want to have it now, we want to see it grow, we want to maximize the progress towards some great end, a manifest destiny, American dream, just an enterprise, right? That's how we think of Christianity. Europe, when I said a culture is Europe, they're very satisfied in it. And that's another problem where you just get sad. It's just a church and you just do it and you just kind of, each one has its issues. See, an enterprise is fine in itself, businesses and all that, but we expect Jesus to make us bigger, to make us powerful, to make us marketable, and ultimately we want to be culturally dominant, or it's a failure. We literally tried to expedite God's return in the early 20th century. Literally tried to get Jesus to come back quicker. That's an enterprise. You say it's called the social gospel. I won't go into it. You can look it up. That's the nature of our way. We're impatient. We're going to make it happen. And God's saying, you're not going to make it happen. I'm going to make it happen when I decide. You're not the one who decides what's wheat and tares. I'm going to be the one who decides what's wheat and tares. You're not going to decide what's success. I'm going to decide what's success. Your metrics are not my metrics. And this is hard for us because we have a pretty good idea what we think success looks like. We say it's bigger, better, faster. Go to other places around the world and you find the church, it says, you know what? Success may look more like a very strong family core. Not about how big it gets. It's all kinds of, we pour our own metrics upon it. I'm not saying one's right, one's better than the other, actually. What I'm saying is that God is the one who decides success, and it's his metrics, not ours. And that metric, he tells us, is faith in Jesus. That's the metric he's looking at. Jesus does not provide the leadership we kind of like. He doesn't give us the leadership we prefer. We want someone to say, I'm in charge, and it'll be done by the end of summer. God says, I'll get it done, but this ain't Burger King. You'll do it my way. This is what it means that God is God and I am not. We are just a beloved stalk in a vast field of God's loving concern. Trust the patience of the good gardener. There is a point to faith and faithfulness, a harvest. When Jesus told this parable, he knew that he would function himself like a seed, that he would die, he would be planted in the ground and rise to offer life to all people. And Paul picks up on it. He says, we must all die to ourselves, I'm paraphrasing, so that we all might live. That becomes the paradigm of life, becomes the paradigm of living. That means giving your heart to Jesus, who was so loving and so patient that he himself endured the suffering to sow good seed. When we accept Jesus as Lord in our life, then we produce fruit. When God so decides, there will be a harvest, and God will create a new heavens and a new earth, he says. Which means a place, I don't know exactly what that's going to look like or how that means, or nobody really knows. But it means a place where all things are right. Where there's no tears, where there's no death, where we treat each other properly, where we have access to God and we're in his presence. That's what people say they want. and it'll come. But what do we do in the meantime? There's this beautiful balance in this parable I just love. You're obviously, here in this parable, you're obviously out of line. If you go zealously change the world by condemning anyone and everyone who isn't perfect, and a perfect church, an imperfect person, if anything you think is in the way of utopia, we want to destroy it. And this parable says, no, that's of course not how you do that. Yet, there is a harvest. See, that can make you cynical, right? That can make you cynical. Well, if God's just going to take care of it all at the end of the world and there's nothing I can't judge, then maybe I just sit and chill, right? Maybe I don't do anything. I just get cynical. The world's how it is and God will take care of it, and I just go about my business, right? I mean, that's one outcome of this, except the one problem is there's a harvest. There's a point to growth. There's a point to growing. So it isn't that we can get pessimistic, like nothing's ever going to get better. I tell you what, if you have given up on goodness, if you've given up and you're bitter and you're cold and you're cynical, then you're forgetting the harvest. We are known because we are Jesus's, because we are in Jesus, and it means that God builds the kingdom through us using tools like forgiveness rather than condemnation, reconciliation rather than elimination. This balance reminds me of an old joke I'd tell, especially during COVID. I like to say it a lot during that period. I'd say, do you know how to make God laugh? Tell him your plans. Right? Here's the balance. Here's the balance to this quote. Do you know how to make God cry? Tell him you don't have any. We allow God's kingdom to work, to grow through our lives without judging him for not doing enough. In other words, we have to make our plans. We have to grow, but knowing that he can do what he wants. And he expects us to grow. He expects us to have faithfulness. This can make us discontent, though, when we feel like we have given more than God. You know what? I've been working on my growth, but I don't feel like I've gotten enough health back. I don't feel like I've gotten enough of this back, or whatever it is that your life is seeking. He took this from me, even though I've been so faithful. He took my health. He took my family member. He took this from me, even though I've given him so much grace. That brings up the one real difference between the weeds and the wheat: contentment. For weeds, God is never quite enough. It always is a God and thing. If the and ever disappears in your life, like God and health, if the health ever disappears, then you'll think God isn't enough, didn't do enough, didn't help enough. And when the and dies, your faith dies, you're not in the wheat category. Does that make sense? It means your faith was in the and thing, not in the God thing. God, not thing. They had gone, I sympathize with this particular couple. I met some time ago, and I met the wife and the husband. They went through some really bad kidney issues for several years, and they had gone to church for several years and say they believed in God. But through this, they had stopped believing. And wonderfully, she had a transplant, and she's mostly fine today, but they never got their faith back. And I understand we have ups and downs, and we have times of lows and highs. But essentially, because God put them through that pain, a good God wouldn't allow that. That's their mind. That's how their mind thinks. That's how a lot of us think. But this is a God and situation, right? This is God and my health. See, when the world shook, they got shaken because their faith was God and health. God and, we have it, God and money, God and spouse, God and fairness, God and sexuality, or anything else, God and anything else leaves you vulnerable. How do you know if you have an and or anything else? Because if it goes away and your faith goes away, you were God and. And it's that simple and that difficult in our hearts to deal with. And you'll know when your faith dies. If your faith dies. Here's the good news. You didn't actually have faith in the real God. Which means the real God is still there. And you can turn to him and he loves you and he says, I understand that maybe you didn't have it right in your head. Maybe you didn't understand that you had it right in your heart. You were worshiping a fake God anyway that didn't exist. I'm the real God. Come to me now. So if you have a God and in your life, that's a fake God that is just health. It's just money. It's just those things. And you're trying to sprinkle a little bit of divine magic upon it with your religion. That's not the real God. The real God wants you and loves you and has everything you need. And the wheat says, God is enough. God is enough. There's this lady whose health has failed. I'm not going to tell you who she is. You know, many of you know her. And I suppose this could probably be more than just one person from even just this congregation. And yet when I visit her, she's in really bad health, doing pretty poorly. And when I visit her, I believe she encourages me more than I encourage her quite regularly. She said, and I was asking, how are you doing with your faith? God gives me hope I never deserved. Forgiveness he never owed me. And so many gifts in life that no matter what happens, God is enough. It's a quote from her. Is God enough for you? He will make all things right one day. Even if life isn't going how you want, even if evil seems to be winning, even if death has taken us for now, he will win. And as the angels sort out the weeds and the wheat at the end of time, it is knowing Jesus and knowing he is enough that will make them say, these are the fruit of my Father's garden.